They created the most influential jazz-funk rhythms in American history, but a ruthless capitalist safe kept the true identity of the meters locked away. Relentless exploitation and starvation wages drove their founder into a devastating cycle of drug dependency and total physical collapse. Instead of offering a hospital bed, management swung a legal blade, casually discarding the man who built their empire. Overnight, an unknown session player was dropped into his seat to keep the corporate revenue flowing. Crushed by the threat of total bankruptcy, the three remaining brothers were forced to step onto the stage, smile falsely at the audience, and perform while their founder rotted in the shadows. The roots of this bitter corporate severing trace back to a time before the lawyers and the ledgers took control. Long before the grueling stadium tours, the soul of this band was forged in a vastly different environment. In the mid-1960s, New Orleans was a city dripping with humidity, segregation, and unparalleled musical heritage. It was a cultural cauldron where the blues, traditional jazz, French Caribbean syncopation, and the polyrhythmic chants of the Mardi Gras Indians bled into the cracked pavements. In the dimly lit, suffocatingly hot clubs of the French Quarter, a new sound was violently trying to be born. At the absolute center of this gestation was Art Neville. Born in 1937, Art was already a local titan by the time the decade turned. He was a keyboardist with a voice that carried the heavy, soulful weight of the American South. A man who commanded respect the moment his fingers touched the ivory. He was the anchor, the older brother, the visionary, who understood that the future of music lay not in the melody, but in the spaces between the beats. In 1965, driven by an unyielding creative hunger, Art formed a group he called the Neville Sounds. He did not look for polished, obedient studio musicians. He looked for raw, feral talent, recruiting three younger men who were barely out of their teens. On bass, he found George Porter Jr., a teenager whose playing was a deep, muddy river of continuous groove. On guitar, he brought in Leo Nocentelli, a technician who played his instrument like a percussion piece, delivering scratchy, rhythmic strikes that chopped through the heavy southern air. And behind the drum kit sat Joseph Zigaboo Modeliste, a rhythmic anarchist with a staggeringly unorthodox sense of time. When these four men played together, the chemistry was not merely good, it was alchemical. They did not play straight on the beat. They played around it, pushing and pulling the tempo, creating a deep, infectious pocket of empty space that physically forced the human body to move. They were the architects of the second-line funk rhythm, translating the chaotic, joyous street parades of New Orleans into a tight, lethal musical weapon. Night after night at a Bourbon Street club called the Ivanhoe, they played grueling, hours-long sets to packed, sweating crowds. The air was thick with smoke, cheap liquor, and the sheer kinetic energy of four men communicating telepathically through their instruments. It was here, in the raw, unfiltered environment of live performance, that their bond was forged. They were not just a band, they were a living, breathing organism. If Zigaboo dropped a beat, George caught it. If Leo went off on a wild, jagged tangent, Art reeled him back in with a warm chord progression. They trusted each other with their lives on that stage, and it was precisely this undeniable magnetic brilliance that caught the attention of two men who would change their lives and eventually seal their fates, Allen Toussaint and Marshall Sehorn. Toussaint was a musical genius in his own right, a prolific songwriter, producer, and the creative engine of New Orleans soul. Sahorn, his business partner, was a sharp, calculating white music executive with an eye for the bottom line. Together they ran Sansu Enterprises, a formidable independent label that operated as the ultimate gatekeeper of rhythm and blues in the city. Toussaint and Sahorn were not talent scouts looking to nurture artists. They were industrialists looking for raw materials. When they walked into the Ivanhoe and watched the Neville sounds tear the roof off the building, they did not see four young artists with dreams. They saw an engine. They saw a rhythm section that could be bolted into their studio to manufacture hits on an industrial scale. The approach was swift and deeply seductive. Toussaint and Sahorn offered the young men a deal. Leave the grueling club circuit. Come into the air-conditioned sanctuary of the recording studio. Become the exclusive house band for Sansu Enterprises, and in return, record your own records. To four working-class black musicians in the segregated South of the 1960s, this sounded like the breaking of the dawn. It was the promise of legitimacy, of global reach, of finally getting off the grueling, low-paying club grind. They accepted, but the very first condition of the new arrangement was a subtle, fatal shifting of identity. The Neville Sounds was a name that belonged to art. Sansu Enterprises required a name they could control. The band was renamed The Meters. What the four men did not comprehend as the ink dried on those early agreements was that they were signing away the very ownership of their creative identities. The contracts drawn up by Sansu Enterprises were masterpieces of systemic exploitation, perfectly reflecting the predatory nature of the music business of that era. The industry was fundamentally designed to separate the creator from the creation. The executives understood a profound legal reality that the musicians did not. Playing the music generates pennies, but owning the paper generates millions. Almost immediately, the psychological dissonance began to take root. Entering the studio in 1968, the Meters were put to work as a human assembly line. They provided the backing tracks for a staggering array of Sansu's roster. They were expected to walk in, listen to a rough vocal track or a piano melody, and instantly invent the grooves that would make the songs hits. They were the invisible backbone of a musical empire, paid flat, nominal session fees, sometimes as little as $20 a track, for creating bass lines and drum breaks that would eventually generate fortunes. Simultaneously, they were allowed to record their own instrumental tracks. In 1969, they released Sissy Strut and Look Kapai Pai. The impact was seismic. Sissy Strut climbed to number 4 on the national R&B charts, a miraculous feat for a raw, vocalless instrumental track. The music was a revelation across the United States. It was complex, jazzy, yet raw and accessible. Suddenly, the Meters were playing on national television. Their music was blaring from car radios from New York to Los Angeles. They were famous. But fame, they quickly learned, is not currency. The true horror of their situation began to reveal itself in the mail. As Sissy Strut sold hundreds of thousands of copies, the royalty checks delivered to Art, George, Leo, and Zigaboo were insultingly small, or entirely non-existent. The legal trap had sprung closed. Under the terms of the system they had entered, the Meters did not own their publishing rights. The lucrative mechanical royalties generated every time their songs were played on the radio, sold in a record shop, or licensed for use, bypassed the musicians entirely and flowed directly into the bank accounts of the executives. More devastatingly, Toussaint and Sehorn had legally trademarked the name the Meters. This was the ultimate act of corporate colonialism. The four men who sweated, bled, and invented the sound did not own the title of their own collective. They were legally reduced to the status of independent contractors, permitted to wear a corporate uniform. The name on the marquee did not belong to the men on the stage. For men in their late 20s and 30s, realizing you have been legally outmaneuvered is a quiet, rotting kind of trauma. They had built a kingdom of sound, only to realize they were locked outside the gates, peering in as other men counted the gold. The stage, once a place of absolute freedom and joyous expression, slowly morphed into an invisible labor camp. They were generating immense wealth, yet they were returning home to New Orleans struggling to pay their basic utility bills. The injustice was not just financial, it was an assault on their dignity. They were grown men, fathers, and recognized geniuses in their field, yet they had to beg the front office for advances on their own meager wages just to survive. As the decade turned and the 1970s loomed, the pressure cooker began to hiss. The management, eager to capitalize on the band's growing reputation, booked them on relentless, grueling tours. The strategy was clear. If the studio was the factory, the road was the retail outlet. They were sent out across the country, riding in cramped vans, eating cheap food, sleeping in substandard motels, and playing night after night to fulfill the demands of the corporate ledger. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological burden was heavier. They were famous, they were revered by their peers, but they were perpetually broke. For the younger members, George, Leo, and Zigaboo, the frustration manifested in anger and musical aggression. But for Art Neville, the founder, the man who had brought them all into this world, the burden carried an unbearable weight of responsibility. He was the older brother who had led his family into a golden cage. As the tours stretched longer and the financial realities became starker, the exhaustion seeped into Art's bones. The human body is not designed to sustain the adrenaline of a 3-hour stage performance, followed by the crushing depression of financial servitude. Something had to give. The foundation of the band was cracking under the weight of the capitalist machine, and as the 1970s progressed, the system would prove just how disposable a musical genius truly was. As the 1970s dawned, the Meters found themselves trapped in a devastating paradox. Their cultural influence was expanding exponentially, yet their financial autonomy was shrinking to nothing. The systemic exploitation they endured was not a localized accident. It was the standard operating procedure of the American music industry, a machine specifically calibrated to extract maximum value from marginalized artists while insulating the executives from any financial risk. To understand the cruelty of this system, one must understand the weaponization of debt. When the Meters went on the road or entered the studio, the expenses, travel, lodging, recording tape, studio time, were paid by Sansu Enterprises and their distributing label, Reprise Records. However, these were not investments, they were loans. This accounting practice, known as recoupment, meant that every dollar spent to promote or record the band was charged against the band's infinitesimal share of the royalties. Because Toussaint and Seahorn owned the publishing and the trademark, the executives collected the lion's share of the revenue right off the top. The band members were left to split the scraps, but only after their artificially inflated debts to the label were paid off. They were placed on a corporate treadmill designed to never stop spinning. They were effectively indentured servants, financing their own exploitation. The psychological toll of this arrangement began to hollow the men out from the inside. By the early to mid-1970s, the Meters were universally revered by their peers. Paul McCartney personally requested them to play at the release party for the Wings album Venus and Mars, held on the Queen Mary. Dr. John leaned heavily on their groove for his masterpiece In the Right Place. Robert Palmer flew to New Orleans specifically to use them as his backing band. They were the musicians, rubbing shoulders with the wealthiest rock stars on the planet. Yet the cognitive dissonance was staggering. They would stand in a studio and lay down the definitive rhythm tracks for global superstars, absorbing the praise of multimillionaires, only to walk out the door, get into a cramped, unair-conditioned van, and drive 14 hours to a gig that barely paid enough to cover the gasoline. They were famous enough to be recognized on the street, but poor enough to face the very real threat of eviction. It is a unique, corrosive kind of humiliation to hear your own genius blasting from a stranger's radio while you struggle to feed your children. Nowhere was this grotesque disparity more visible than in 1975, when Mick Jagger personally invited the Meters to open for the Rolling Stones on their monumental tour of the Americas. To the public eye, this was the ultimate validation. The Meters were playing to packed stadiums, standing before 50,000 screaming fans every night. But the backstage reality was a portrait of capitalist disparity. The Stones traveled in private jets, stayed in luxury penthouses, and commanded millions. The Meters, the architects of the funk that the Stones so desperately admired, traveled on shoestring budgets, stayed in substandard motels, and played for a negotiated opening act fee that barely kept them afloat. They were guests at the banquet, permitted to smell the feast, but explicitly forbidden from sitting at the table. The relentless, grinding friction of this life began to physically and mentally break the band. The road is an unforgiving environment. It demands youth, stamina, and a certain degree of hopeful delusion. But for Art Neville, the founder and the eldest of the group, the delusion was dead. Art was approaching 40. The physical labor of hauling a massive Hammond B3 organ across the country, combined with the sleep deprivation of endless highway miles, was tearing his body apart. But it was the mental exhaustion that proved fatal. Art possessed a deep, brooding intelligence. He knew exactly what was being done to him and his brothers. He knew that the name he had built, the sound he had pioneered, was enriching white executives in air-conditioned offices while he sweated under stadium lights for pennies. The anger and the helplessness metastasized into a deep, clinical depression. To survive a system that views you as a machine, you eventually have to anesthetize the human parts of yourself. Art Neville did not turn to drugs for recreation. He turned to them for survival. Heroin and cocaine became the chemical shock absorbers required to endure the pain of the road and the humiliation of the contract. The narcotics provided a temporary artificial distance from the reality that his life's work had been stolen. This descent into addiction was not a sudden plunge, but a slow, agonizing erosion. His bandmates, George, Leo, and Zigaboo, watched in horror as their leader, their older brother, began to unravel. Art started missing rehearsals. His legendary timing began to slip. The man who had once commanded the Ivanhoe with the mere tilt of his head was becoming a ghost. His physical frame withered and his spirit retreated behind a wall of chemical dependency. In any humane industry, this would be recognized as a catastrophic occupational injury. A manager who viewed their artists as human beings would have halted the tour, intervened, and sent the founder to a rehabilitation facility. They would have recognized that the addiction was a symptom of a structurally abusive environment. But the executives holding the leash of the meters did not traffic in empathy. To the management, the deteriorating health of Art Neville was not a human tragedy. It was a logistical inconvenience. A canceled tour meant a disruption in cash flow. The machine demanded blood, and as long as Art could be propped up behind a keyboard, the machine did not care if the blood was poisoned. As the decade crept toward 1977, Art's body finally began to shut down entirely, setting the stage for the most ruthless corporate betrayal in the history of rhythm and blues. The year 1977 arrived not with the triumphant fanfare of a band at the height of its creative powers, but with the grim metallic rattle of a machine tearing itself apart from the inside. By this point, the cultural footprint of the meters was colossal. They had birthed a rhythmic vocabulary that was actively being studied, mimicked, and outright stolen by musicians across the globe. Yet inside the tour vans and backstage dressing rooms, the atmosphere was suffocating. The physical and psychological decay of Art Neville had reached a critical mass. The founder, the elder statesman who had single-handedly assembled this quartet of geniuses, was physically collapsing under the compounded weight of chemical dependency and unyielding corporate exploitation. To witness a man's nervous system shatter under the demands of a predatory contract is a uniquely horrifying experience for those forced to watch. George Porter Jr., Leo Nocentelli, and Zigaboo Modelisti were no longer just bandmates. They had become reluctant hospice nurses to a man whose spirit was being steadily drained to satisfy a tour schedule. Art's performances, once the gravitational center of their live shows, became terrifyingly unpredictable. The Hammond B3 organ is a massive, complex instrument that requires absolute physical coordination and deep intuitive focus. It is an instrument that demands a pilot, but the pilot of the meters was fading into the ether. There were nights when Art would sit behind the keys, his body slick with the cold sweat of withdrawal or the heavy narcotic fog of self-medication, barely able to lift his hands to strike the chords. The groove, which had once been a telepathic conversation between four brothers, fractured into a desperate exercise in musical life support. George, Leo, and Zigaboo had to play harder, faster, and heavier just to cover the gaping, agonizing holes left by their dying leader. In the ruthless calculus of the 1970s music industry, a sick musician was not a patient. He was a breach of contract waiting to happen. The executives holding the leash, Marshall Sahorn and Alan Toussaint at Sansu Enterprises, were monitoring the situation not with compassion, but with the cold, detached arithmetic of factory foremen observing a malfunctioning conveyor belt. Promoters had paid for the meters. Venues had booked the meters. The label expected the promotional tour to continue seamlessly. The concept of pausing the tour, sending art to a rehabilitation facility, or providing psychiatric and medical support was entirely antithetical to the business model. Black artists in the segregated, heavily exploitative infrastructure of Southern rhythm and blues were historically treated as disposable commodities. You did not repair a broken tool, you discarded it and bought a new one. When the breaking point finally arrived in late 1977, the management handled it not as a human crisis, but as a swift clinical termination of a disposable asset. Art Neville simply could not go on. His body refused to comply with the demands of the schedule. He needed to stop, to breathe, to heal, or he was going to die on the road. But when this reality was presented to the management, the response was not a discussion of medical leave. It was an immediate, ruthless termination. This is the precise moment when the invisible cage of copyright law snapped shut with bone-breaking force. Had the band owned their own name, they could have legally halted operations. They could have protected their founder, but they did not own themselves. The executives reminded the band of the fatal clause hidden deep within the paperwork they had signed a decade earlier. Sansu Enterprises owned the trademark The Meters. The name was a corporate asset. Art Neville was merely a contracted employee, and the corporation was now terminating his employment. The cruelty of this expulsion is difficult to overstate. Art Neville was the father of the band. He had named the Neville Sounds. He had chosen George, Leo, and Zigaboo when they were just kids playing in local joints. He had orchestrated the very sound that made the executives rich. Yet, he was cast out into the streets of New Orleans entirely empty-handed. There was no severance package. There was no buyout of his shares because he possessed no shares to buy out. He was stripped of his publishing, stripped of his dignity, and formally severed from the musical identity he had spent his entire adult life building. The system chewed up his youth, his health, and his brilliance, and spat out a broken, addicted man, leaving him to face a potentially fatal withdrawal without a safety net. But the corporate machine did not pause to mourn. The tour dates were looming, and the ledger demanded to be balanced. To ensure the revenue stream remained uninterrupted, the management initiated a maneuver that demonstrated a profound, almost sociopathic disrespect for the art form itself. Funk music relies on chemistry, a deep cellular connection that takes years to cultivate. You cannot simply swap a musician in a deeply intuitive jazz-funk quartet and expect the soul of the music to survive. But the executives did not care about the soul. They cared about the silhouette. As long as there were 4 men on stage playing the recognizable notes of Sissy Strut, the promoters would pay the invoice. Overnight, the management reached into the local New Orleans music scene and plucked out a keyboardist named David Batiste. Batiste was a highly competent working-class musician, but in the context of this tragedy, his musical pedigree was irrelevant. He was brought in to be a scab. He was a human spare part, shipped overnight to fill a void that could not logically be filled. The management handed him the set list, pointed him to the Hammond B3, and effectively told him to wear the skin of the man they had just discarded. For George Porter Jr., Leo Nocentelli, and Zigaboo Modeliste, the arrival of the replacement keyboardist triggered a profound psychological crisis. The immediate visceral reaction of the three remaining brothers was sheer, blinding outrage. The instinct of loyalty demanded that they walk out. How could they possibly step onto a stage, play the bass lines and drum breaks that Art had helped them write, while a stranger sat in Art's chair? The moral imperative was clear. They had to quit. They had to stand in solidarity with the man who had given them their careers, protest the inhumane treatment of their founder, and let the corporate machine grind to a halt. But the machine had anticipated this rebellion. When the three men balked, the management deployed the ultimate weapon of capitalist coercion, the threat of total financial annihilation. The executives, armed with armies of lawyers, laid out the stark, violent reality of contract law. George, Leo, and Zigaboo were signatories to a binding touring contract. If they walked away, they would not just be fired, they would be sued for breach of contract. They would be held personally, financially liable for every canceled show, every refunded ticket, and every lost dollar of promoter revenue. In the 1970s, for black musicians who had been systematically denied access to wealth accumulation, this threat was a death sentence. They had no savings. They had no lucrative royalty streams to fall back on because those had been stolen too. They had families, mortgages, and children. The lawyers made it impeccably clear, if you walk out that door to support Art Neville, we will take your homes. We will freeze your bank accounts. We will ensure you are tied up in litigation for the rest of your natural lives. And we will make certain you never work in the music industry again. The executives held a financial gun to the heads of their families and dared them to pull the trigger for the sake of artistic integrity. The trap was inescapable. The three men were cornered, their morality crushed beneath the sheer weight of legal extortion. They were forced to submit. The psychological violence of what followed cannot be quantified in a courtroom. George, Leo, and Zigaboo were compelled to become active accomplices in the erasure of their best friend. They had to pack their instruments, board the tour bus, and sit in silence next to the man who had replaced their brother. The camaraderie that had once defined the meters, the jokes, the shared history, the brotherhood of the road was replaced by a toxic, suffocating silence. The band was no longer a brotherhood. It was a hostage situation. When the lights went down in the arenas and the announcer's voice boomed over the PA system, introducing the legendary meters, the true depth of their humiliation began. The three men had to walk out from the wings, the heavy glare of the spotlights hitting their faces. They had to strap on their guitars and sit behind the drum kit. They had to look out at thousands of cheering, dancing fans who had paid to see the kings of funk. And then they had to look across the stage and see a stranger's hands touching the keys. They were ordered to play. And because they were professionals, because their survival depended on it, they played brilliantly. The rhythm section was as tight and ferocious as ever, but behind the syncopation, behind the blistering guitar solos and the earth-shaking bass lines, the men were dying inside. They were forced to pantomime joy. They had to smile for the photographers, nod to the beat, and pretend that the soul of the band had not just been amputated without anesthesia. Every note they played felt like a betrayal. Every cheer from the crowd felt like a mockery of Art's absence. The audience danced, blissfully unaware of the bitter reality unfolding before them. The tight, infectious funk Making them move was now being generated by men trapped by the threat of bankruptcy, playing flawlessly out of pure survival, while the architect of their sound sat miles away in the dark. The psychological theater of that final tour in late 1977 is a subject that demands careful dissection because it reveals the absolute limit of what the corporate machinery can extract from a human being. On paper, the tour was functioning perfectly. Tickets were sold, venues were packed, and the designated duration of stage time was fulfilled every single night. Miles away from the stage lights, the executives simply reviewed the incoming ledgers. To them, a broken component had been efficiently swapped out, and the corporate machine hummed along without skipping a single beat. But on the stage, a profound and invisible death was occurring. Funk music is not classical music. It cannot be transcribed onto sheet music and executed by rote memorization. It is an oral tradition of spontaneous, collective architecture. It requires deep listening, vulnerability, and a shared emotional vocabulary. When George Porter Jr. and Zigaboo Modeliste locked into a rhythm, they were not counting beats. They were communicating a lifetime of shared struggle, joy, and cultural heritage. The absence of Art Neville fundamentally severed that communication. David Batiste, the session keyboardist brought in to replace Art, was entirely blameless in this tragedy. He was a working musician hired to do a job, dropped into the middle of a family trauma he did not create. But to the three remaining members, he was a walking, breathing symbol of their own subjugation. He was the physical manifestation of the management's contempt for their brotherhood. Every time Batiste struck a chord on the Hammond organ, it was a glaring auditory reminder that Art was gone, left to face a grueling physical withdrawal alone in the Louisiana heat. The notes Batiste played were technically correct, but they lacked the specific, heavy, behind-the-beat drag that was the signature of Art Neville's soul. The resulting sound was a grotesque, uncanny valley of funk. It sounded like the meters, it looked like the meters, but the spiritual core of the music had been hollowed out. For George, Leo, and Zigaboo, the aftermath of the shows became a daily exercise in coping with intense moral injury. When the stage lights cut to black and the roar of the audience faded, the adrenaline evaporated, leaving only a thick, suffocating residue of shame. They retreated to their hotel rooms in silence. There was no post-show celebration, no collaborative debriefing about the music. They were grown men, recognized globally as the undisputed masters of their craft, yet they felt like indentured laborers forced to perform a minstrel show for a corporation that held their family's financial security hostage. They began to rely on alcohol and isolation to numb the cognitive dissonance. They were playing music that was inherently designed to represent freedom, liberation, and Black empowerment. Yet they were doing so with corporate shackles firmly locked around their ankles. It is a unique form of psychological torture, to be applauded by thousands of people for a lie you are being forced to tell. However, the executives at Sansu Enterprises had made a fatal miscalculation in their understanding of human endurance. They believed that because the threat of financial ruin was absolute, the compliance of the musicians would be infinite. They fundamentally misunderstood that while you can use legal terrorism to force a man onto a stage, you cannot mandate the human spirit to continuously generate art under conditions of profound despair. The internal architecture of the band was collapsing, But the fractures were not solely caused by corporate pressure. Years of relentless touring, financial disputes, and the exhaustive burden of carrying a severely addicted bandmate had deeply eroded their brotherhood. Resentment grew not just toward the management, but toward the inescapable reality of their situation. The telepathic musical connection that had made them legends began to fray under the combined weight of exploitation, bruised egos, and profound exhaustion. The joy was dead, and without joy, funk music devolves into mere noise. By the end of 1977, the situation reached an unavoidable terminal velocity. The breaking point did not arrive with a dramatic, explosive confrontation, but rather with a quiet, exhausted realization among the three men that bankruptcy was ultimately preferable to spiritual death. The tour limped to its contractual conclusion, and when the final note was struck, the band simply ceased to exist. They did not announce a hiatus. They did not negotiate a restructuring. George Porter Jr., Leo Nocentelli, and Zigaboo Modeliste laid down their instruments and walked away from the corporate entity known as the Meters. They accepted the devastating financial consequences. They walked away from the meager but consistent session wages. They walked away from the infrastructure of the label, and they walked out into the terrifying uncertainty of unemployment. They chose poverty over complicity. The immediate aftermath of this disbandment left a landscape of profound irony. Marshall Sahorn and Alan Toussaint were left holding the legally bulletproof trademark of the Meters. They owned the name, they owned the publishing rights, and they controlled the master recordings. But they had fundamentally failed to realize that a trademark cannot play a bass guitar. A copyright cannot generate a drum break. By pushing the human beings inside the machine beyond their absolute breaking point, the executives had killed the golden goose. The name The Meters was placed into a corporate vault, transforming instantly from a living, breathing cultural force into a dormant, sterile asset. The management had won the legal war, but in doing so, they had extinguished the very product they sought to exploit. While the corporate machinery ground to a halt, a deeply human story of survival was unfolding back in the humid neighborhoods of New Orleans. Art Neville, discarded by the industry and ravaged by years of systemic abuse and chemical dependency, was facing the abyss. There were no luxury rehabilitation clinics available to him. There was no industry support fund. He was left to endure the agonizing, bone-crushing physical reality of heroin, withdrawal in the suffocating heat of the South. The music industry had extracted his youth and discarded his ruined body, expecting him to quietly become another tragic casualty of the road. But the industry had failed to account for the one force stronger than a recording contract: blood. Art Neville was not alone. When the corporate executives abandoned him, his biological family stepped in to fill the void. His younger brothers, Aaron, Charles, and Cyril, rallied around him with a fierce protective urgency. They did not view him as a broken commodity. They viewed him as their patriarch. They physically and emotionally anchored him to the earth while the withdrawal tore through his nervous system. They provided the sanctuary that the management had ruthlessly denied him. It was a slow, brutal process of reconstruction, built not on the demands of a touring schedule, but on the unconditional foundation of brotherhood. As Art slowly regained his physical strength and mental clarity, A profound psychological shift occurred within him. The trauma of his expulsion from the meters had left a deep, jagged scar, but it also catalyzed a fierce, unyielding determination to reclaim his sovereignty. He realized that the fundamental error of his youth was entrusting his creative output to men who viewed him as a raw material. He understood that if he was going to step back to a keyboard, he would never again do so under the banner of another man's corporation. By the late 1970s, as Art's mind cleared, he began to jam informally with his brothers. Aaron possessed a voice of angelic, trembling beauty. Charles was a jazz saxophonist of staggering intellect. Cyril was a fiery percussionist with deep ties to the militant polyrhythmic energy of the Mardi Gras Indians. Together they possessed a musical pedigree that was unmatched in Louisiana. They decided to form a new group, but this time the foundation would be radically different. They did not go to a management company to seek permission or funding. They named themselves the Neville Brothers. The creation of the Neville Brothers was not merely a musical evolution. It was an act of profound psychological rebellion. It was a direct, defiant response to the trauma inflicted by Sansu Enterprises. By choosing a name that explicitly stated their biological bond, they were signaling to the industry that this entity could not be trademarked, fractured, or fired by an executive. Art Neville returned to the stage not as a hired hand, but as a sovereign artist leading his own bloodline. The system had attempted to erase him, burying him under a mountain of legal paperwork and corporate indifference. But as the 1980s approached, Art Neville was preparing to prove that while a corporation can steal a brand name, it can never extract the genius that gave that name its power. While Art Neville was forging a triumphant and sovereign second act with his biological family in the 1980s, the dormant corpse of his first creation was undergoing a bizarre, unprecedented resurrection. The corporate executives at Sansu Enterprises had locked the name and the master recordings of the meters in a vault, assuming the catalog would generate a slow, predictable trickle of licensing fees for the rest of their lives. They viewed the music as a closed ledger. What they failed to anticipate was the technological and cultural earthquake that was about to strike the American musical landscape. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a new generation of musicians began scouring the dusty crates of secondhand record shops, looking for the raw materials to build a new genre. Hip-hop was born from the act of sonic excavation, and producers were hunting for the heaviest, most unbreakable drum breaks and bass lines ever recorded to serve as the architecture for their verses. When these producers dropped the needle onto the old vinyl records of the meters, they hit the motherlode. The music of the meters was perfectly engineered for the sampler, because they had operated as a tight four-piece unit devoid of sweeping orchestral arrangements or overproduced studio gloss. Their grooves were naked, dry, and infinitely loopable. Zigaboo Modeliste's staggered, syncopated drum patterns were a revelation to hip-hop producers. Leo Nocentelli's scratchy guitar riffs provided the perfect aggressive texture. Almost overnight, the foundational DNA of the meters was violently extracted from the 1970s and transplanted into the golden age of hip-hop. Their rhythms became the heartbeat for a staggeringly diverse array of artists. A Tribe Called Quest, Public Enemy, NWA, the Beastie Boys, Run DMC, and LL Cool J all built massive multi-platinum anthems upon the structural framework of the meters. Their sound became ubiquitous, echoing from boomboxes on the streets of the Bronx to the lowriders of Compton. Yet, this monumental cultural validation brought with it a renewed and excruciating psychological trauma for the original band members. History was repeating itself with terrifying precision. A new generation of young, powerful black artists was using the meters' grooves to speak truth to power and achieve global superstardom, generating millions of dollars in the process. But because of the labyrinthine slave contracts signed in the late 1960s, the clearance fees and mechanical royalties for those samples did not go to the men who played the instruments. The money flowed straight back into the hands of the executives who owned the publishing. For George Porter Jr., Leo Nocentelli, and Zigaboo Modeliste, the 1990s became an era of haunting omnipresence. They were in their 50s, many of them still grinding out a living playing local gigs in New Orleans or working as hired session men, while their youthful genius was being blasted from every radio station in the world. It is a uniquely modern form of psychological torture to walk into a supermarket, hear your own drumbeat propelling a #1 hit, and know that you do not have the legal right to claim a single penny of its value. They were the most sampled musicians alive, yet they remained effectively disenfranchised from their own legacy. The systemic theft had simply entered its second generation, evolving from the exploitation of their physical bodies on tour to the digital exploitation of their recorded ghosts. But the men were no longer the naive teenagers who had walked into the Ivanhoe Club decades earlier. The anger that had forced them to walk away from the band in 1977 had matured into a cold, calculated resolve. They realized that waiting for the industry to suddenly develop a moral compass was a fool's errand. The only language the corporate machinery understood was litigation. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the original members of the Meters embarked on a grueling, protracted legal war to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. This was not a glamorous fight. Litigation is a slow, grinding form of bureaucratic violence. It required the men to sit in sterile conference rooms, confronting the executives who had discarded Art Neville and reliving the humiliations of their youth while parsing through decades of intentionally obfuscated accounting ledgers. They were fighting to untangle themselves from contracts that had been designed by experts to be inescapable. They sued to reclaim their unpaid royalties. They fought for their songwriting credits, and crucially, they battled to reclaim the legal right to use their own name. The legal battles dragged on for years, a testament to the stubborn arrogance of a system that believed it possessed a divine right to the perpetual ownership of black art. Slowly, agonizingly, the walls of the corporate fortress began to crack. The sheer volume of unpaid sample clearances and the glaring inequities of the original agreements forced settlements and renegotiations. The musicians finally began to claw back fragments of their publishing rights. The checks, though decades late and heavily compromised by legal fees, finally began to arrive, but more importantly than the money, they won back their identity. The profound healing of this victory culminated in the early 2000s, when the original four members, Art, George, Leo, and Zigaboo, agreed to share a stage once again. They initially toured as the Funky Meters, a necessary legal workaround, before finally triumphantly reclaiming the right to bill themselves simply as the Meters. When they stepped onto the stage at the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, unspoken, emotional weight. They were older men now. Their hair was gray, their faces lined by the brutal mileage of the road and the courtroom. Art Neville sat behind the Hammond B3 organ, moving slower, his body carrying the permanent scars of his battles with addiction and the systemic abuse that triggered it. But when he laid his hands on the keys and Zigaboo dropped the beat, the years evaporated. The telepathic connection, dormant for decades, instantly reignited. They were not playing as employees fulfilling a corporate quota. They were playing as sovereign owners of their own sound. The groove they laid down that afternoon was not just a musical performance. It was an act of profound historical correction. They had survived the machine. They had outlasted the men who tried to break them. They were looking out at a sea of thousands of people, not with the forced, humiliating smiles of their 1977 tour, but with the quiet, defiant dignity of men who had walked through hell to get their names back. Art Neville spent the final years of his life universally recognized as a patriarch of American music. He won Grammy Awards, he toured the world with his brothers, and he witnessed his early creations become the bedrock of global pop culture. When he passed away on July 22, 2019, at the age of 81, he did not die as a discarded, broken asset in a corporate ledger. He died at home, surrounded by his family, deeply revered by an entire city that viewed him as royalty. The system had tried to hand him a death sentence in 1977, but he had rewritten the final act on his own terms. Epilogue. When we examine the history of the 20th century music industry, it is remarkably easy to be blinded by the glamour of the stage and the rhythm of the records. But the true story of the Meters is a stark reminder that behind every immortal piece of American art, there is often a hidden ledger written in blood and exhaustion. The narrative of Art Neville, George Porter Jr., Leo Nocentelli, and Zigaboo Modeliste strips away the romanticized veneer of the recording industry to expose the brutal mechanics of capitalist extraction. Their story forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about how culture is produced. The executives at Sansu Enterprises did not view music as a sacred expression of human emotion. They viewed it as a raw mineral to be mined, refined, and sold. They weaponized copyright law to sever the artists from their own creations, and they weaponized the threat of poverty to enforce compliance. The decision to discard a dying founder and force his grieving brothers to perform alongside a hired replacement was not an anomaly of the era. It was the ultimate logical conclusion of a system that values the trademark over the human being. Yet, the ultimate legacy of the Meters is not one of victimhood, but of indestructible resilience. The corporate executives may have possessed the legal paperwork, but paperwork is sterile. You cannot copyright a feeling. You cannot trademark the precise microsecond of delay in a drum beat that makes a human body want to dance. The management tried to reduce the magic of Four Brothers to a mere line item, but the music proved to be too massive, too kinetic, and too deeply rooted in the human experience to be contained in a filing cabinet. When you listen to the sharp, snapping snare drum of Sissy Strut today, you are not just hearing a foundational piece of jazz funk. You are listening to an auditory fossil of a war. You are hearing the sound of men playing for their lives, carving a space of absolute freedom within a cage of absolute exploitation. The contracts eventually expired. The executives faded into historical obscurity, but the groove remains immortal. The system tried its hardest to consume them, but in the end, the meters left behind a rhythm that the machine could never break and a legacy that could never be bought.